Ok, buonasera a tutti, buonasera, benvenuti. And I have to apologize to my fellow Italians here, but for matters of practical flow of information between Fritz and I, we decided we were going to do this in English. So we'd like this to be a kind of conversation between us. And I'm going to be the moderator here, because as it usually happens during our work on the field, we've been left to our own devices. We are just by ourselves here, so I'm going to be Sergio Ramazzotti, the photojournalist, and I'm going to be the moderator as well. And so let me introduce Mr. Schaap as a regular moderator would say, but my good friend Fritz, my good friend and colleague Fritz, with whom I've shared a lot of stories, a lot of war coverage. We did a lot of stories together for the Spiegel, and Mr. Schaap, or my good friend and colleague Fritz, is Der Spiegel's Africa bureau chief, an Africa correspondent. And thanks a lot, really, thanks very much for being with us here tonight. We are, as you know, we're going to talk about endless wars, and this is a topic that we decided to talk about a long time ago when we were asked to come here for this conference. It might sound extremely well-timed given what's happening in Ukraine, but I got some numbers I want to share with you, and I want to share with Fritz as well. And the funny thing here is we didn't prepare anything. Oh, I prepared something, but I didn't want to share this with Fritz because I want this to be as spontaneous as possible. I want to be a surprise for you as well. And one more thing, as you probably know, photojournalists and journalists, I've been a photojournalist 30 years, are pretty shy people. They express themselves with photographs, or with written texts. And they don't really like to be on stage and they especially don't like to have a monologue. So ideally, we wouldn't like this to be a monologue. We would like to have as much interaction with the people here. So we rather like this to be conversational sort. So if any of you feels like interrupting us and asking a question, that question would be most welcomed. But let's go back to the topic. The topic is endless wars. And I knew you would expect a PowerPoint presentation, but we are the old school guys, so Fritz still writes with a thing called a pen on a piece of paper and still use an old-fashioned instrument called a photo camera. We're not very digital, so you would expect probably a PowerPoint presentation, but here's something that I wrote on a piece of paper. And I'd like to start with a few numbers that I'd like to share with you. Numbers that I found in two essays written by historians M.R. Davian, J.D. Carty, and F.J. Ebling. Davian has calculated that in a substantial part of human history, from 1496 BC, before Christ, to 1861 AD, that is, in a period of 3,357 years, there had been only 227 years of peace on the planet, on the known planet. The remaining more than 3,000 years, at least one war had been fought, at least one. More or less in the same period, that's still Mr. Davian writing this, In the same period, 8,000 peace treaties had been concluded that were destined to last forever, but each one had lasted for an average of less than 2 years. And Cartier and Ebling tell us that in the 116 years between 1829 and 1945, wars had claimed more than 59 million lives. That's astonishing. In Europe alone, the cradle of Western culture, as many as 286 wars have been fought in the last 3 centuries. It's amazing. And when I was saying the topic that we chose, endless wars, might seem especially well-timed, given what's happening in Ukraine these days. Well, maybe not, maybe really not. Ukraine is a war that we feel with a special empathy, something that I haven't seen before in recent conflicts being fought on the face of the earth. Maybe because it's very close, maybe because it affects us in a number of ways, number of direct and indirect ways, much more than many other wars being fought today on the planet affect us. But let me share with you another number. The number is 59. I found this number on a website called the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. And on that website, there's a partial list, well, there's a total list, but I want to share with you a partial list of the ongoing conflicts on our planet today, classified according to the commonly accepted definition of the term war, which is open and declared conflict between 2 or more states, or more generally between organized ethnic, social, religious group conducted with the use of military means. There's a war going on in Nigeria, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region, in Myanmar, in the Kashmir region between Pakistan and India, 2 nuclear powers that have been fought over the land ever since the partition in 1947. In Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Somalia, in Mozambique, in Israel, in Palestine, in Libya, in Western Sahara, most of these places we've been together. In Afghanistan, where there has been virtually non-stop fighting since the 1970s, and in Ukraine, the latest to be added to the list. But it's the total which is frightening. That number I was sharing with you earlier on, 59. 59 armed conflicts are being fought on our planet. And it's scary, it's a scary number, especially if you think in percentage terms. I did a few calculations here. It's true that there are almost 8 billion human beings today on the face of Earth. But these 8 billion live in only 208 nations. So the most cautious calculations tell us that at least 1 in 3 of the world nations is experiencing an armed conflict today on the face of our planet. So we seem not to be able to learn from the lessons of the past, even though it's a not extremely distant past, like the other day. And each one of these conflicts causes casualties, devastation, physical and psychological trauma, economic loss, refugees, as we are seeing in Ukraine, and these are numbers that are nearly impossible to reliably estimate. But most of all, it's impossible to predict many of the collateral, mid-term and long-term consequences of a conflict. I'm thinking, and we were actually discussing this yesterday, so you should know about it. I'm thinking Congo. When we were in Congo, you remember, 2019, Fritz and I were there on behalf of the Spiegel to cover the second largest Ebola epidemic in the history of the virus. That was being fought against in the Kivu region, in the North Kivu region of the RDC. And we horribly realized how the instability caused by the however low intensity conflict there, that instability turned out to be actually the virus' most effective ally and the most effective enemy of those who were trying to contain that epidemic. You remember that?
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy. That, I mean, and if you call it a low-intensity war, it was over 100 militias fighting each other, so it's a little tricky to call it low intensity, I guess. But yeah, it was interesting to see that politicians riled up for their own gains, people behind whatever cause, and basically created an atmosphere where people got so angry at the NGOs, at the people helping them, that the virus could spread for years. And I mean, there was a vaccine, as you remember. It was not that they couldn't get it under control. It was the riled up people by selfish politicians that prevented basically the epidemic to be ended quickly.
Yeah, and I remember what happened. We were there for like 15 days.
Oh, wow. Quite a bit, yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and probably during the first week, the only two Ebola treatment centers that had been set up by Médecins Sans Frontières, by Doctors Without Borders, got attacked by militias.
In the course of 5 days it was.
In the course of 5 days.
I think it was 5 days difference between they burned the first one and then they attacked the second one.
So what happened after the 6 days, Médecins Sans Frontières decided to evacuate all their
the white personnel.
The white personnel. So, and I remember covering, that was by myself, another major Ebola epidemic, the one that took place in Western Africa between 2014 and 2015. And there was he was classified afterwards as the most serious Ebola epidemic since the virus was isolated in the 1970s. And even though the numbers were much higher, even though a vaccine had not been synthesized yet, it was, since those were peaceful countries, basically, Liberia, and the neighboring countries, it was much easier to contain such an epidemic, which ended up, causing 11,000 victims, but the medical and paramedical personnel were free to move, and they could react and act in order to contain it. It was much worse in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But let's go back to the general topic of wars. One question that, well, probably the question that we've been asking ourselves so many times when we covered conflicts together, and which most war reporters, I guess, they keep on asking themselves, is only one. Why? Why? Why, as I was saying earlier on, humanity seems pathologically unable to learn from their own mistakes. And for some time, this is a surprise to you, I apologize in advance, but for some time I thought to find a possible answer in this sentence of Adolf Hitler, contained in his autobiography, Mein Leben. Did I pronounce it correctly? Mein Leben.
I didn't read it though.
Okay.
I don't think it's legal.
Not that I'm a big fan of Hitler, but for some reason it is enlightening. Well, hear this. Hitler wrote, only in the struggle of two different worldviews is it useful to resort to the weapon of brutal force. stubborn and ruthless force, which will naturally decide the victory. So, sorry, I gotta follow a bit of a trace here, otherwise I tend to be extremely logoroic. We're never gonna end this by, it's already 6:25 by 7 o'clock, and I think we're gonna be chased out of the 7 o'clock. In other words, war is useful only to settle a disagreement between two different worldviews. That is, almost always. Almost always.
I wouldn't say so, not anymore. I think that changed. If you look at a lot of the wars that are fought in Sahel, there's no ideology. Well, the core is not ideology, I would say. This is wars about land. It's access to fertile land. It's wars that are fought because climate change is taking care that fertile land is getting less and less, and population growth is taking care that there's more and more people that live off the same little shrinking amount of land. And I think the ideology in the Sahel, the jihadism, this is all a top layer of an underlying current that wars are being fought for land more and more, and that's something we're going to see in the future. Those are going to be the forever wars in the future, I'd say, over land.
Yeah, and I want to come to this. I want to come to these two factors, which probably will be crucial for the future of human beings and for the future of wars all over the planet, overpopulation factor and the climate change factor. But before doing that, I'd like to share a little story with you, a story that came to my mind just the other day. I live in Milano, but I am originally from Marche, from 90 kilometers from here. And we still have a little country house in Marche that used to belong to my grandparents and to my great-grandparents before them, and God knows for how many generations that's been my house. And the nearest country house is a few hundred meters away, and that's my neighbor. And my neighbor is called Quinto. Now, I think you met him. No, we didn't meet him.
I don't think I did.
Not yet. But this is a nice story. Now, Quinto owns some land, and I do own some land, and our lands are separated by a pretty long border. Quinto is 85 years old. Quinto speaks a very tight dialect. I'm from Marche, but I can't speak the dialect. I have a hard time understanding him anyway. He's deeply Catholic and has been a farmer all his life. I'm 30 years younger. I don't understand his language. I'm afraid to say I'm an atheist. And I don't even know where to start when it comes about tilling a field, cultivating a field. I don't have a clue. In other words, Quinto and I have very, very little in common. And in some way, you might say we have two radically different worldviews. You might say that. Yet, we get along, Quinto and I get along, have been getting along for the longest time perfectly well. We have never, we have never waged war against each other, neither metaphorically nor physically, which is something that in Italy tends to happen between neighbors. Just the other day, he came to me and he said, oh, I need to prune that tree. That tree is exactly on the border between my land and his land. And he said, can we share the cost? Can we share the firewood that will come out of the pruning? And he came in the most respectful way, even though I don't know anything about when it's time to prune a tree, what the risks of not pruning it might be. And this prompted me to think about a few factors why we had never waged war, Quinto and I, against each other. And I made a little list that I want to share with you. I'm with you. It's all surprises here. I made a list. Here it is. Quinto and I, number one, we are aware that we belong to the same ethnic group, which means the same race, which means the human race. So we never had any occasion to emphasize our differences from an ethnic or linguistic point of view, although it is a fact that we speak almost two completely different languages. Number two, we never, ever insulted each other's religious beliefs. If you can call atheism a religious belief, I think you can. On the contrary, we've ever always treated each other's religious belief with deep respect, even though I'm pretty sure that Quinto considers me to be a sort of a son of Satan, but whatever. We have no expansionist aims. I mean, we are, none of us has ever coveted the other's resources. We are perfectly content, the two of us, with the resources we have. Or he never had the need to try and conquer the other's resources. Mind you, it's just a little list, innocent little list. We have never threatened or insulted each other, especially not in public, because in Marque's culture, this would be tantamount to losing face. And losing face in Marque leads to be basically ostracized by society. And our borders, the borders of those two pieces of land that belong to us, they have never been drawn in a recent or distant past by a victorious army. They haven't been drawn by a supranational organization. They haven't been drawn by the United Nations, for instance. No, they have been drawn by our ancestors throughout an infinitely long period of time. Probably one of my ancestors one day in the distant past bought land from Quinto's ancestor and probably the other way around. But the point is, we recognize those borders as a consequence of a long-term relationship between our ancestors. And for us, those borders are kind of sacred. And then one thing that might be fundamental, if the equivalent of our GDP falls by 0.2%, none of us considers that a catastrophe. And here's another one, perhaps just as fundamental. We have both seen war. Quinto is 85, so he went through at least the whole Second World War. And I've seen war, we've seen war with our eyes in so many places in the world. And another thing we were discussing, and I'd like to share this,
I would say
national pride. We don't have a national pride.
Yeah, but I feel the crucial point you mentioned is need. None of you is facing any sort of existential threat. So there's no driving force to step over all those other unifying points, because if he would be close to starving, it would be a whole different kind of ballgame. If you would be close to starving, it would be a matter of existential threat to you, and that would be a reason. And that's what I was saying before, when you were talking about ideology driving wars, which it does. I mean, Ukraine is driven by some weird ideology of Putin's in part. It is different in Africa, where I think most wars, well, not most wars, but the mean ones in the Sahel are driven by existential threats. People are killing each other because they are facing starvation in the worst cases.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think, yeah.
But this list was just a little experiment that I decided to do the other day. It's not a list of solutions, mind you. journalists are not there, and their task is not to provide solutions, it's just to document problems as thoroughly and as, how to say, intellectually honestly as they can. But it's a simple list of reasons why we had never fought a war, Quint and I. And I said simple. You might think it's even simplistic, and probably is simplistic. But then if you think about the solutions that mankind has devised for extremely complex problems, after they have been found out, discovered, and put in place, put in practice, if you look backwards, they always look simple, so simple. And we might say so simplistic that you wonder, why didn't we think about them early on? Just one example, we were discussing this morning, COVID-19. That was a major global problem, and the solution to it, if you look at it now, and then science itself, looking at it now, says it's an extremely simple solution, finding a way of synthesizing a vaccine based on messenger RNA, which is a thing that most scientists will go, why did we think about it earlier on? It's a simple solution that was found in a period of time, 7-8 months, absolutely fractional if you think of the 8 to 10 years that normally were necessary to develop any vaccine. So I'm giving you a list of whys we haven't fought a war. This is not probably a list of solutions, but it's an interesting inspiration, I think, something to meditate upon, because probably the most important point is we never suffered lack of resources. And here we come to the two factors for the future. Climate change and something that most people don't want to talk about loud, overpopulation. The overpopulation factor is...
But it's a massive factor. I mean, as I told you the story, I was in Nigeria in February, and I was following that mediator who was mediating the conflict between herders and farmers in the Middle Belt. A conflict which is rarely talked about. It's happening all over the Sahel, and it's especially bloody in Nigeria. I think it has, in some years, it had 4,000, 5,000 dead. Just small incidents, farmers killing herders, revenge killings. There's a circle of violence in them. So we were following this mediator who kind of lost hope in the success of his mediation. It was a rather sad story. It was supposed to be a beautiful story, but it turned out to be a really sad story. And he said something very worrying that, I was saying, Fritz, look at the country. It has 220 million inhabitants now, and it can't properly support them. In 2050, most predictions say it will have doubled. It will have almost double, 400 million. And he said, Fritz, the only thing that I see that could happen is civil war, because the country can't support this amount of people, not infrastructure-wise, not land-wise, not food-wise. And I mean, that's a global phenomenon. And of course, it will not have the same effects in Europe, where you have stable economies and you have infrastructure in place and you have safety nets. But it will be a massive cause of conflicts and wars in Africa. I mean, you can already see it, like all those conflicts in Chad, for example. It gets accelerated by climate change and overpopulation. Funnily, not only overpopulation of people, but also of cows in the Sahel. But that's not the topic here.
Yeah, and in the long term, climate change, desertification, for instance, you were telling me today, there's a desertification going on in Germany.
Parts of Eastern Europe.
So it might be a crucial factor in Europe as well. I'm trying to picture an image like a civilian any civilian taking up a machine gun and go fight for a cause, any cause, national pride, a common enemy, or any cause. And I have a hard time picturing that. It's much easier to me to imagine a housewife, your average housewife, to take a machine gun and shoot somebody else over the last drop of water, if that drop of water was needed in order to give it to her son, who was dying of thirst, right? So the climate change factor. But I'd like to go back to national pride for a sec, and I got another interesting quote. This is by Adolf Hitler as well, which can be to some extent enlightening when it comes to dive a little bit deep into the psychology, the psychological dynamics of war on a collective level. And Hitler says, the people are accustomed to see in the ruthless attack against their adversaries the best proof of their right. The people, resent the renunciation of the destruction of the adversary as an uncertainty with respect to that right, if not as an index of their own wrongness. And before you think I'm a Hitler enthusiast, I got to counterbalance this sentence with another thing said by the Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States. Roosevelt said, "No triumph of peace is more exhilarating than a triumph of war." So it is, at some point, it is also a matter of national pride. And it struck me a lot what you told me the other night. We were discussing about this, not about this conference. We were discussing about wars. This is what most of the times we meet to discuss about. And you were telling me the incredible job that Germany has done to rewrite if its notion, popular notion of national pride.
I wouldn't call it, I think Adorno once called it the first post-national state, Germany, and that is something, if it would be true, which it of course isn't, it is to a certain degree, but of course not in total and not for everybody. But as a German growing up, it was kind of national pride was something which you wouldn't understand because it wouldn't make any sense. And you saw with your own eyes every day, you could still see them, and you see the scars of war in every German city for all the right reasons. You could see what it does and what it had done, and that national pride rarely led to something really good. In the end, it leads to conflict if there's too much of it. And that is kind of like a way of thinking that was, at least in my generation, how do you say in English, entrenched into people's thinking. That's how I grew up, and I find it if it would really be the first post-national state, as Adorno once said, it would be a great thing, but of course it isn't. But I think there was, I mean, you see the hesitancy in the Germans' approach to wars all over the world, and this pacifist kind of thinking, and that derived from the Second World War. And I think, of course, denazification wasn't as good as it should have been, but it was what it was. And then compared to a lot of other countries that waged war, I think Germany did quite an okay job in kind of learning from the past.
Yeah, and speaking about learning from the past, no, we said earlier on, mankind seems unable to learn from his past errors, even from the day before yesterday. Many times we wondered while we were covering a conflict, does it really make sense? If we are pathologically unable to learn from the ugly examples that our ancestors, our fathers, our grandfathers have given us, or even the bad examples coming from the most recent conflicts like Afghanistan, like Iraq, if we are unable to do that, what's the point? We ask ourselves these questions a million times. What's the point in documenting a conflict? Does it make any sense?
I think it will,
I
I don't think we'll solve or we'll end any conflict, but I think it might be way worse if there wasn't people documenting the conflicts we document. If there would be no accountability, because people said, hey, it's not doing much difference anyways, and we would stop doing what we're doing. I would say conflicts would be worse than they are.
Yeah.
It might be very hopeful and positive thinking, but I try to think it is that way.
Yeah, the real problem when documenting a conflict is probably even the fact that I'm probably more talking as a photographer and thinking about telling a visual story of a conflict like we did many times. You have to deal with a kind of contradiction because you need an image, you need a set of images which unfortunately have to be shocking. Otherwise, public opinion doesn't get shocked, it doesn't realize there's a conflict, doesn't realize the extent of damage and ongoing and potential done by that conflict. At the same time, when you're covering a war, you don't want to see that. No psychologically healthy human being would like to see suffering. And at the same time, you have to go look for that. And you have to go look for, I like your obsession, it's an obsession I share, for a protagonist. A protagonist might be, whenever Fritz and I are supposed to document a conflict, the first thing we are looking for, or especially Fritz is looking for, is a protagonist. Now, the fact that you always look for a protagonist, somebody who embodies the war and becomes a paradigmatic figure, becomes an archetypal figure of that conflict. I think about another sentence, a famous sentence, and here we balance, because we have had Hitler, we have Roosevelt, and now we balance that with Stalin. So we have all the three blocks, the major blocks in which the world was divided, at least up to 50 years ago. And Stalin famously said that the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million is just a statistic. So in some sense, I get a feeling as a photojournalist, and from the reactions that I can fathom when my photographs, my picture stories get published, I had the feeling that it's, for much of the public opinion, a war is just a statistic. And the farther away a conflict, the more it looks like statistic. The more, there's an old saying in journalism, then if you want to make, if a distant catastrophe, very distant catastrophe wants to make the news, it's got to be a huge number of victims.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, if you look Ukraine, the coverage is huge because it's close. But you've covered Tigray, I covered Tigray, and there were some estimates coming out from a Belgium university. There's a group of researchers trying to keep up statistic on the famine, and they estimated that 200,000 people died of starvation in the conflict, and it's been going on for not even 1.5 years. And I tried to cover it and keep it in the news, but it was rarely talked about. It's not, nobody went to a talk show on TV and let's talk about Tigray and the blockade the government has put in place and how they're deliberately starving people on an incredibly scale. Because it's just very far away. It's somewhere in the northern Ethiopian mountains, and people really wouldn't care here that much.
Yeah, but if you think about it, yeah, you said the right thing. I mean, people don't care too much about it because the place is distant. It's a faraway place, but
it's also
in
culturally distant to a
Yeah.
lot of people, and Ukraine isn't, hence the...
But in almost every war that we covered, if you think of it, there was some degree of involvement by our countries, either directly or indirectly. I remember Ethiopia, just to make a little example. Now, this is something we should care about. Italy is profoundly involved business-wise in Ethiopia. We've been building the Great Renaissance Dam, the Africa's biggest dam, which has been one, you may say one, of the causes of the war in Ethiopia, or it's definitely been a major cause for friction between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. NL has significant investments in Ethiopia. So we're talking about public money. We covered
Same
Libya.
goes for Western Sahara.
Or Western Sahara. We covered Libya, and we should have been aware of what was going on in Libya. So every conflict you cover, no matter how many the victims, it's something that has to do with home to some degree. And this is something that I have a hard time understanding and coming to terms with, especially when we talk about Italian media. I mean, a thorough coverage of something happening on the other side of the world, it always makes sense. When I ask you the question, it was obviously a rhetorical question. Does it still make sense to cover a war? Of course it does. Of course it bloody does. It's a duty. We need to open our eyes, and no matter how far. And if we had, I kept on asking myself throughout the 2 years we've gone through of COVID-19 pandemic, if we had a better coverage from the very start of what was happening in Wuhan, maybe in February, March 2020 in Italy, when we were very badly hit as the first country in Europe by the first wave, this tsunami of pandemic, maybe we would have been more prepared. Maybe we would have been telling a very different story. Maybe we could have saved tens of thousands of lives. And if, in turn, we had a better coverage of Ebola. We've been talking about Ebola in Congo, Ebola in Liberia. If we had a better coverage here, I remember when we covered Ebola in 2019, when I covered Ebola in 2014, nobody cared about it in the Italian press about it. Nobody cared about it in the Italian press. Nobody. It was a thing happening to some people 6,000 kilometers from here. But if we had a better coverage, a better understanding of what was happening, of the dynamics of the virus, how the virus was spreading there, and which were the procedures put in place there to contain it, maybe, I say maybe, we could have told a different story. We would have been more prepared when it came to deal with a major epidemic that turned into a pandemic in February 2020. So it definitely always makes sense. And it almost always there is a connection back home. When we're talking about conflicts, when we're talking about natural disasters, when we're talking about...
I mean, the connection back home, for example, I don't want to always go back to the Sahel, but I think there is a connection back home that is very important, that it might just well be a window into the future. The wars that are fought there over land, it might well happen in Europe in 30, 40 years. I mean, there is desertification, as you said, in Germany already. Parts of Spain might become desert, parts of Italy. And then, you have mass migrations, and you might just as well have conflict. I mean,
then that's where I can really picture an Italian or German housewife taking up arms to defend their kids. Yeah. I really very much would like to entertain some sort of conversation with the public here. I very much would like it. Is it possible? What do you think? No? It's not. It is. Wonderful. This is be against the rules, I was told, because COVID-19 prevents our friends here to give around microphones. Okay?
I wrote my university thesis about Western Sahara and Western countries. And what I think about those countries is that at some point, some political powers think that now just let this conflict to stop, then the world will forget about it. And I'm writing about foreign policies about Western Sahara or Sub-Saharan Africa, and I think that this problem is not only in that region, but also in Nigeria, in northern Kivu, in Sahel, Mali. How we journalists, how much we can do for stop this tendency to forget those scenarios, those wars.
So basically the question is, what should we journalists do in order to keep on bringing and keeping conflicts, the awareness that there are also those forgotten conflicts, kind of forgotten conflicts that like the Western Sahara one, keeping this notion alive among the public opinion? Well,
always go back. Just always go there and report. It's funny that you said, because we have just been to Western Sahara, and what struck me, because I mean, their cause is the right cause. And on the same side, it was so difficult working there. It took us a year, or I don't know, even 1.5 years to get accreditation, to be allowed to go there, to report on that conflict. And once we got there, we were forced to some sort of North Korean propaganda show, and it was really tough working there. And if you worked on it, it surprised me how little they understood that if they would just let the press work freely there, it would be way better for them than to have this theater play put in place, which they did, to my huge surprise.
yeah, and you may want to mention this. We ended up. I'll leave this to you. We ended up in the hand of Coronel commanding a unit, and there was.
Yeah, that was, I mean, it was kind of unresponsible. You covered wars, I did, so we kind of know, but there were like 50 journalists, a lot of them, I would say, unexperienced in war reporting. And then we were with this colonel, and we drove to the desert like 30 hours till we finally got to the front line. And then he was so eager that we see the war. He drove with us to the front line and had 3 Grad rockets, I think, fired at the Moroccan base 9 kilometers away, and then insisted on us waiting for the Moroccans to shoot mortars back. And it was just all so absurd. And it was really one of the most absurd researches I ever did in a war zone, because if you would be in Syria or in Libya and you would embed with people that were fighting the regime, for example, they would know how important the press is. And then Western example, it's just an anecdote now, but Western Sahara really surprised me how little they understood how the press needs to work and cover their conflict in order for them to get the attention they need and they should have. Because I mean, as you said, Enel is working, is building a solar plant in the Moroccan part of the Western Sahara. Siemens, I think, is building wind turbines. And they all do that. And by doing that, they silently accept the status quo that Morocco established and playing into Morocco's hands. And then it's one of the big Western Sahara, if you ask me, one of the big Völkerrecht, how do you say in English? I actually don't know the English term by international law. It's
Say that again.
Völkerrecht. No, we don't have to go into that. But it is one of the last...
How can we ever get along? I don't speak a single word of German. You don't speak a single word of Italian. How can we get along? I don't know.
But yeah, I mean, that was just a side note on Western Sahara.
Yeah, and yeah, it's just about to follow up on that question. It's just about continue publishing. And unfortunately enough, we have daily feedback. I the co-founder of a photojournalism agency. We've been syndicating photo reportage all over the world for the past 15 years, ever since we founded the agency. We have experience, we have daily feedback of a kind of lowered interest and throughout the public opinion about seeing conflict images, about seeing stories that talk about wars. I mean, we can see that in Italy especially. Germany is a completely different thing, but the average interest of the average Italian magazine towards a story that has to do with a war being fought somewhere else, even though we said most of the times there's a strong connection to here, to back home. The interest has been thoroughly declining throughout the years, to the point that there's almost no space left on Italian media for that kind of stories. And there's been a kind of addiction by the public opinion to that kind of pictures. This means that pictures that tell a story of a war have to be stronger and stronger every day in order to capture the attention of the public opinion. And that's why I believe that photography, and sorry to say that, but yeah, I'm very proud of working for a magazine that still sends around a team of two people, photojournalists and journalists, who work together in the same story, and pictures go so well together with the story, and they are a powerful weapon to capture the public opinion's attention, which is something that doesn't happen anymore, almost anymore, in Italian media, provided there's any Italian media left. Yeah, we still have daily newspapers, not so much about, not sure about weekly news magazines like the Spiegel, after what happened to L'Espresso last month. But I'm very proud of being part of a team of two people covering, producing harmonious kind of storytelling that is double as effective. But if you think about the fact that statistics tell us that on social media, which is a powerful instrument for information dissemination, that for many people it's the main source of information. On social media, videos have an attention span, an average attention span of 3 seconds. So much so that if you buy space on Facebook, you want to advertise on Facebook, Facebook tells you that video sells you that single view of the video if the video has been watched for at least 3 seconds. And 85% of videos on social media are watched without audio. So what is 3 seconds of video watched without audio? It's a second of video made of 24 photograms, 24 photos in fast succession. So it's 72 photographs you're looking at. If my average person I wanna send a message to with a photography, his average attention span, its max attention span is 3 seconds. Isn't it more effective if instead of 72 photographs, I show just one? So, and if I grab his attention with one photograph, then he probably will read the text, if the text goes well together with that single photograph. Now, we're being chased out. The guys here are getting each. We ran out of time. We need to leave. Somebody else is coming after us. Oh, too bad. I would have liked this to go on forever. But I'm having fun now. But no, we need to leave. Okay, so we leave. Well, we leave. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.